Want to understand why one mobster inherited a life and the other inherited a sentence? A curious ailment afflicts certain figures in this underworld ecosystem. A complete absence of hobbies, interests, or anything resembling a life beyond the daily grind of extortion, intimidation, and petty power struggles. The perpetually agitated personalities, those perpetually scribbling their own gossip columns through paranoia, share one trait above all. Nothing occupies their time except work. Contrast this with the few who bothered to cultivate actual pastimes. Some immersed themselves in World War II documentaries or horse racing. Others busied themselves with running clubs, building model trains, bow hunting, football fandom, or even embracing well-cushioned chemical escapes. These diversions, noble or ridiculous as they may be, served a crucial function. They kept their owners too occupied, or at least too entertained, to start squealing the moment the walls closed in. Consider the hypothetical. An individual steeped in culinary entrepreneurship, complete with a thriving establishment and extracurricular romantic pursuits, would hardly spare a moment for federal agents. Another might find sanctuary in sitcoms and dutiful visits to elderly relatives. Someone else might escape to a favored masseuse. And of course, there are those whose hobby is simply courting the noose with astonishing devotion. In these cases, hobbies reveal themselves as protective camouflage, distractions that stave off desperation. A more revealing comparison emerges when observing two men whose fathers both stood high in the organization. One grew into adulthood nurtured by a parent who encouraged hobbies, collecting trains, bow hunting, following the giants, simple pleasures that carried the implicit lesson that life could be more than violence and vice. The other was groomed through a baptism of blood, sent to kill a stranger while barely past adolescence, treated not as a son, but as an expendable implement. One patriarch raised a human being, the other produced an asset. Yet, amid all this, a familiar refrain surfaces, that none of these individuals worked a day in their lives. An impressive claim, if not for its spectacular inaccuracy. Whatever one thinks of their profession, the upper ranks are nothing if not high-pressure management roles, overseeing volatile subordinates who spend half their time plotting to overthrow them. The mandate is constant: generate revenue, keep the hierarchy satisfied, and avoid becoming the next cautionary tale. The so-called foot soldiers fare no better. They operate under perpetual financial duress, expected to produce a steady stream of cash regardless of circumstance. Even the most loyal among them can be ground down until they do the unthinkable: murder an elderly woman and rob her life savings, not out of desire, but out of pressure. Even if the victim was, by some accounts, less than angelic, the deed hardly qualifies as recreational. In short, the myth that these figures led leisurely, work-free lives is charming, but delusional. Their mistake was not idleness. It was the absence of anything outside the job to soften the inevitable descent. Hobbies, it turns out, were not merely amusements in this world. They were lifelines. Here's what nobody admits about Janice. The most dangerous thing in her life wasn't the mob. It was her taste. Janice's declaration that Cousin Tony was once a fox deserves recognition as one of the series' most dazzling feats of suspended disbelief, second only to the miraculous appointment of AJ as football team captain. The line lands with a thud, not because attraction is forbidden, but because the show asks the audience to swallow the idea that anyone, let alone a blood relative, would describe a cousin with the breathless awe usually reserved for tabloid heartthrobs. Of course, this family has never been constrained by conventional boundaries. Tony fondly reminisced about Janice's youthful build and gorgeous hair, as though admiring a distant acquaintance rather than a sibling. Vito once bragged about nearly seducing his own cousin. Clearly, whatever is in the Jersey water supply does little to discourage improvised genealogical enthusiasm. The script attempts to soften the blow with that familiar refrain: "He's changed so much." Yet the flashback photograph amounts to Steve Buscemi in a wig, a cosmetic adjustment that does little to suggest a fallen Adonis. The explanation, one supposes, is that Janice viewed him through the forgiving eyes of adolescence. Childhood fantasy fashioned him into a fox. Adulthood, aided by an unflattering televised mugshot, corrected the record. In the hierarchy of questionable romantic choices attributed to Janice, ranging from a teenager to two homicidal suitors, a cousin who merely resembles Steve Buscemi hardly registers as catastrophic. After all, anyone who voluntarily entangled herself with both Richie and Ralphie has long forfeited the right to surprise. And yet, the claim still competes for the title of the show's most implausible moment. Only the decision of an Italian-American couple in 1980s New Jersey to name their daughter Meadow gives it real competition. Ever noticed how being Catholic practically served as Tony Soprano's VIP pass into the family? His reactions over the series form a tidy ethnographic map of grudges, prejudices, and that particularly American strain of ethnic white gatekeeping. The Hasidic boyfriend? Instant meltdown. The black biracial Columbia hopeful? Tony browbeats him into confessing the racial category printed on his application, as if paperwork alone confirmed Tony's worldview. But had the young man been a Jewish white kid named Jerome Ginsburg, the temperature in the room would almost certainly have dropped. Tony's outrage, after all, is never indiscriminate. It's curated. The show never bothers exploring Meadow dating a non-Italian white man, which is a missed opportunity, given that her romantic history after Noah is a parade exclusively composed of Italian surnames. The answer, however, writes itself. Tony's approval would hinge less on the man himself and more on how neatly he fits into Tony's crumbling ethno-cultural filing system. This system, incidentally, is proudly anachronistic. 19th century Ellis Island politics preserved in suburban formaldehyde. The crew routinely signals that other European immigrant groups are not quite equals. Christopher describes hell as an Irish bar rigged for Irish winners. He calls Emil Kolar a Polak, deploying a slur with the casualness of someone opening a beer. Anything non-Italian and non-local is by default a problem, until Carmela gently drags Tony into the modern century by reminding him that Catholicism is apparently the universal solvent for his grievances. Even then, limits apply. A Catholic, Polish-American, or Irish-American suitor might provoke some speechifying, but the eventual détente is predictable. The moment the man reveals a crucifix and a steady job, Tony's ire would dissolve into resigned muttering. A Jewish white suitor, however, would generate a longer and more barbed internal debate. Tony inherits his mother's uncanny gift for manufacturing conflict where none need exist, and any deviation from Italian and from the neighborhood becomes fertile ground for grievance. Case in point, he even berates Finn for paying for dinner, apparently a violation of medieval chivalric statutes that only Tony remembers enforcing. Yet the hierarchy is not universal. Some observers argue the opposite, that a wasp, the ultimate emblem of the older, dominant Protestant establishment, would represent Tony's true nightmare scenario. Irish and Polish Catholics, after all, were once dismissed as ethnic whites, a category Tony instinctively recognizes as adjacent to his own. The wasp, however, stands outside that shared immigrant Catholic narrative, a living reminder that Italians once occupied a lower rung. For a man armed with decades of inherited resentments, this is an unforgivable affront. The lived cultural patterns of Italian-American families in the New Jersey-New York corridor echo this logic. Polish Catholics intermarried with Italians regularly. The ethnic rhythms and Catholic roots aligned neatly. Irish and German unions were far less common, burdened by older waves of prejudice. In many households, disdain for Irish Americans was practically a family heirloom. Other Slavic Catholics, Hungarians, Russians, could plausibly integrate, provided the church doors opened on Sunday. Thus, the answer is disappointingly simple. Tony's acceptance is not about whiteness in any modern sense. It's about Catholicism, proximity, and an unspoken ethnic pecking order fossilized sometime around 1950. Anything outside that arrangement triggers his reflexive hostility. The man is, in essence, Archie Bunker, armed with a crew, an Oldsmobile, and the unshakable conviction that his daughter's happiness must never interfere with his prejudices. The Sopranos' ending wasn't clarified, it was sacrificed. And the reason is far pettier than anyone wants to admit. There are unwritten rules in television lore, and near the top of the list is this: one does not casually acknowledge the definitive fate of Tony Soprano. Yet somehow, after 2 decades of careful ambiguity, David Chase, creator, custodian, and occasional arsonist of his own legacy, decided to tip his hand. Not subtly, not artistically, but via the sort of popcorn news headline better suited to celebrity divorces than the closing chapter of a cultural landmark. For years, viewers dissected that infamous cut to black, with reverence usually reserved for scripture. Entire cottage industries of theory sprouted around it. And then came Chase, apparently deciding the 20th anniversary was the perfect moment to flatten 2 decades of mythology by confirming, more or less, that Tony never made it back from the tunnel. A casual detonation, delivered with the enthusiasm of someone promoting the many saints of Newark, because nothing draws attention to a prequel like nuking a beloved mystery. Of course, when pressed, Chase favored a dance of semantics, eyes ricocheting around the interview like a man desperately trying to avoid responsibility for his own words. It was a performance worthy of an award season parody, evasive, theatrical, and somehow still dismissive. But this is hardly new behavior. Chase has spent years insisting he cannot remember, does not care about, or never particularly valued substantial plot points. Fans have long suspected that the writer's room, Matthew Weiner, Terrence Winter, Robin Green, Mitchell Burgess, was the real engine behind the show after its first season. Add to that the seismic power of the performances from Gandolfini, Falco, Imperioli, and the rest of the cast, and the picture becomes clearer. The art evolved beyond its creator, and he has been nursing a quiet resentment about it ever since. The result is a peculiar dynamic in which fans routinely disregard Chase's retroactive commentary on the grounds that the show itself, and those who built it beyond him, understood its world far better than he now claims to. The audience treats the text as definitive, and the creator as a man determined to rewrite his own footnotes. Amid all this, a reminder arises from the more level-headed corners. Not everyone parsing these revelations is an original era viewer. Some were barely old enough to reach a light switch when The Sopranos dominated headlines. Outrage over generational gaps solves nothing. No need to treat this like Twin Peaks. Nobody is performing metaphysical surgery on the narrative universe here. Still, the larger point remains. Some truths, or claimed truths, are best left unspoken. Chase's impulse to clarify the ending of The Sopranos solves nothing, illuminates nothing, and contributes only to the slow erosion of a masterpiece's most elegant mystery. Sometimes, the cut to black should simply stay black. Forget the myth of Junior as a fearsome mob figure. The man couldn't inspire loyalty if he tried. Uncle Junior remains one of the show's most paradoxical creations. A man who spends half his life clawing for respect, and the other half proving precisely why no one ever wanted to give him any. Visibly insecure, chronically petty, and never the sharpest strategist in the room, he nonetheless occupies a strangely durable place in the family hierarchy, thanks in large part to his surname and his proximity to Johnny Boy. His early years hardly suggest a prodigy. Even those inclined to flatter him tended to be the sort of sycophants who confuse age with wisdom. Yet dismissing him as a bumbling relic misses an inconvenient truth. When Junior actually suppresses his volcanic pride, a competent mind flickers to life. The brief détente with Tony reveals a man capable of sober assessment and surprisingly measured counsel. He can read shifting loyalties, recognize that certain pretenders, Richie for instance, lack the stature to seize power, and align himself accordingly. His maneuvering may not sparkle, but it is seldom rash. For someone often treated as the family's comic relief, he displays a notable instinct for political survival. His limitations, however, are the very qualities he refuses to acknowledge. Junior is a creature of resentment, forever nursing the indignity of being Junior, despite being the elder brother. It is the perfect metaphor. A man technically senior, emotionally stunted, and perpetually outranked. He possesses neither the charisma of Johnny Boy, nor the gravitational pull of Tony or Jackie Sr. He masterminds no innovative ventures, inspires no loyal followings, and governs with a level of pettiness that manages to be both small-minded and overbearing. His reign as boss is less a leadership arc than a cautionary tale about the perils of confusing entitlement with ability. What he could have been is perhaps the most tragic element. Junior has the makings, if not of a varsity athlete, certainly of a competent consigliere. When confined to the advisory lane, he becomes something resembling effective, perceptive, steady, and capable of steering others away from rocks he would have eagerly crashed into himself. Had he possessed Silvio's self-awareness, or the humility to forego titles that fed his ego, he might have excelled as the quiet strategist in the corner, rather than the blustering patriarch at the head of the table. Instead, he spent a lifetime reaching for roles he was temperamentally unfit to hold, mistaking proximity to power for proof he deserved it. Junior was never boss material, but in rare moments, when pride loosened its grip, he almost looked like someone who could have advised one. Are you trying to piece together why the man who called Pussy a two-faced traitor suddenly became so shy with federal information? The enduring mystery is not whether Big Pussy met a watery end. Everyone with two neurons to rub together accepts that. But why Ray Curto, ever the dutiful federal informant, never bothered to hand the FBI the single most obvious gift of his career. He knew the crew took Pussy for a ride, knew the euphemism wasn't exactly subtle, and even lamented missing the outing himself. It doesn't take forensic brilliance to deduce what happened next. Would that alone produce a conviction? Of course not, but it would have given the Bureau enough of a breadcrumb trail to at least pretend to investigate. A boat can be found. DNA can be tested. Dock security cameras can capture 4 men marching off and 3 trudging back. Skip could testify to the last time Pussy was seen alive and confirm that the Witness Protection Program had not suddenly adopted a telepathic admissions policy. It's practically procedural television, yet Ray kept his mouth shut. Either he believed the Bureau was gullible enough to buy his wide-eyed routine, or he was simply uninterested in detonating the entire organization immediately. Perhaps shielding Silvio or Polly had its appeal. Perhaps maintaining his earning power until his child's medical needs were secured seemed more pressing than serving justice. Self-preservation is rarely subtle. Critics often insist that Ray didn't know enough to be useful, that he had nothing but hearsay without a body, and no wire recordings of Tony, Silvio, or Polly discussing the murder. True, the details of that boat ride were tightly held. Only the 3 executioners and Pussy's wife knew he stepped out of the house with them that night. But Ray was no errand boy. A captain is not low on the totem pole, no matter how creatively one attempts to downgrade his rank. His pointed remark, "One ride I wish I would have went along on," makes his awareness perfectly clear. Ignorant of the choreography, yes. Ignorant of the outcome, not remote. But then again, Ray didn't flip out of moral outrage or civic duty. He wasn't auditioning for sainthood. His quiet cooperation was an insurance policy, not a crusade. In that light, his selective silence becomes entirely consistent. A man breadcrumbing the feds just enough to save himself, never enough to burn down the world he still needed. Are you trying to understand why Carmela's deepest emotional competitor wasn't another woman? Just Tony's unresolved childhood? Carmela Soprano occupies an immaculate place in Tony's life. Immaculate mainly because she's been polished into decor. The blonde, camera-ready wife functions less as a partner and more as the living room centerpiece. Lovely to look at, pleasantly silent when required, and symbolically useful when the neighbors need reminding that the king of the cul-de-sac has a proper household. Naturally, Tony's romantic imagination wanders elsewhere. His parade of dark-haired, dark-eyed lovers reinforces the point that Carmela is not his type. She is his trophy, a human award, a marital state championship, if he'd ever shown the makings of an athlete. The dynamic is simple. Whenever she attempts to assert herself, he responds with dismissal or outright cruelty, as if any sign of personal ambition were an act of insubordination. She may not be a paragon of virtue, but the contempt she receives, both privately and publicly, is far beyond anything she earns. Her own material aspirations hardly complicate the picture. The mythology of Carmela as a woman secretly yearning for humble simplicity evaporates the moment the jewelry cases and car keys come out. The gold chain and the imported sedan are not symbols of oppression. They're line items on the lifestyle she negotiated for. The same competitive streak extends to her children. The facade begins to fracture the moment she sees another girl, Hunter, achieving the future she once loudly forecasted for Meadow. The resulting social stumble is exquisite. A forced greeting meant to remind the young woman of past failures, immediately undercut by the revelation that Hunter is, inconveniently, thriving in medical school. Carmela retreats without so much as a perfunctory congratulations. Empathy has never been the family's strong suit. The Sopranos never miss an opportunity to advertise that their children are naturally superior, even when reality contradicts the brochure. Of course, Carmela did not walk blindly into this life. She married an ambitious young man from a prominent mob-adjacent family in a neighborhood where the code of silence might as well be a zoning ordinance. She understood the trade, and she signed the contract. In that sense, Tony and Carmela deserve each other. Two people perfectly matched in their aspirations, resentments, and selective blindness. Yet their relationship runs deeper than mutual convenience. To Tony, Carmela embodies everything Livia Soprano was not: a caring, affectionate, loyal woman. That is precisely the problem. His affairs are less about lust and more about psychological excavation. He seeks women who mirror his mother's coldness, hoping to pry from them the validation Livia never offered. Carmela's generous love cannot fill that void, and he cannot stand the implication that it should. As for her much-discussed talent as an interior decorator, the evidence suggests her ambitions exceeded her abilities. The Soprano mansion is less the product of a designer's eye and more a shrine to overstuffed furniture and unexamined taste. And therein lies the tragedy, or perhaps the comedy, of marrying one's high school sweetheart. Decades pass, people change, and suddenly the ornamental wife is simmering with discontent, while the husband grows increasingly indifferent. The tension between them becomes less a marital crisis and more an inevitability. By the time the veneer cracks, both parties have long since earned the fallout. Carmela Soprano, status symbol, emotional consolation prize, frustrated social climber, and relentless validator of her own offspring's supposed superiority. Truly a masterpiece of suburban self-delusion. Subscribe.